Are we back? Are we here? Is it happening again?
We're
Here we
back. We're
are.
back. We're back.
We're back. It's summertime. It's hot as fuck.
Yeah. 94 degrees here
Ah!
today.
Okay, not that hot here, but will be tomorrow. Um, for those of you who are watching this and don't know, Aubrey lives in Denver. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and we just tend to get each other's weather like days apart from each other. But that's not the purpose of today's video. Today's video is all about the wonderful, maybe, interesting for sure, inventive, absolutely, Uranus and Gemini.
Yay.
You, I know. I'm going to say people are going to hear a lot of discourse on the internet and outside of the internet around Uranus and Gemini, what it's potentially going to facilitate, what it's potentially going to bring forward. You'll hear a lot specifically around world wars or civil wars, and we will touch on that here because we have thoughts. But that is not going to be the sole focus of this video at all. It's important to understand that Uranus spends about 7 years in a sign, therefore 84 years to make it through the entirety of the zodiac. So the last time we have had Uranus and Gemini was 1942 to 1949. Or actually, technically, there was a period in 1941 it entered Gemini, and then fully in 1942 through 1949. Prior to that, it was 1859 to 1866, and then before that, 1774 to 1782. Clearly, all of those are pretty important in terms of United States history, but we, as you know, we try to have a little bit more of a global viewpoint here. So we will talk about the experience outside of just the US's microcosm. Aubrey, tell me about your interpretation, view, or understanding of Uranus in general as an archetype.
So Uranus as the first, right, like generational planet. This is one of those planets where we start to see larger groupings of people across literally 7 years that have the same Uranus placement in their chart. So, while Saturn, for example, spends 2.5 years in a sign, and we see kind of generations with Saturn as well. Uranus really is our entry into like much longer term groupings of people, which maybe we can kind of touch on what that means a little bit later. But Uranus is the archetype of the rebel. It is the visionary. It is the inner genius. And I really like to think of Uranus as the futurist.
Mm,
So where Saturn loves to come in and create all of these systems and structures and whatever, as far as like government and society is concerned, and points like rules, regulations, etc. Uranus comes in to kind of like shake those things up and dismantle them, and to create new, better, more equal, accessible systems and structures within society. So, the Uranian archetype is always looking to the future, right? Like
mhm,
everything that exists on like the bleeding edge of things is where Uranus lives, right? Like that is
mm,
the Uranian domain. So this is the planet that rules over things like technology, right? I would like STEM in my mind like falls
mm.
under Uranus's umbrella. And also when I think of like Uranian type people, I think of like Nikola Tesla, for example,
Mm.
right? Who had this incredible vision around electricity and physics and like all of these things, and no one understood him, right? Like they all thought he was insane. And even though now we reference Nikola Tesla all the time and use so many of the things that he was sort of inventing and coming up with and thinking about, he died penniless and everyone thinking he was a fool, right? And I feel like that's actually a really good example of like Uranus energy, right? Where it's like, yes, it's the inner genius and you're thinking about these things and inventing these things and like all this stuff that in the future is going to make the most sense and people will use all the time. But in the moment, there's that sort of inherent misunderstanding right? You might see these sort of future oriented things and be correct about them, but everyone else around you is like, what are you talking about? Right. So, anyways, that's maybe more on like a personal level also than a super collective one. Um, but yes, Uranus ruling over like the masses in a way.
Hmm.
Right. And we see things that happen for the collective and the masses. And it is the planet ultimately of radical change and upheaval. Right. So the way I like to describe Uranus to people in readings, for example, is it's like, well, Uranus can be dormant in our lives for years and years and years, potentially. And then all of a sudden it's just like, boom, right? It kind of hits you out of nowhere, completely unexpected. I think the very nature of Uranus is that we don't know what it is, right? Like we cannot expect it, we cannot predict it. It does just kind of hit you out of nowhere. And it's also usually these kind of fleeting moments that happen, right? So it's
Hmm.
like this big change or this big thing that comes in and it leaves just as suddenly as it showed up, but in its wake, everything has changed.
Hmm. It's the disruptor, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the free thinker. Um, I've often read, heard, digested that Uranus is also the higher octave of Mercury,
Yeah,
right?
I completely agree with that.
So where Mercury is consciousness, Uranus becomes the collective consciousness,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
I view the transpersonal planets as sort of like a journey that we undergo. So Uranus kind of being the beginning part of that journey, the inspiration, the awakening that often happens too. We'll talk about this. I think you and I talked about this earlier today too. Uranus and Gemini might be like time for us individually and us collectively to like wake up a little bit more. The kind of the journey that we take to get to Uranus, though. So if we think about if Saturn is the last planet we can see from the visual, from like the naked eye in the sky, the celestial body that actually moves between Saturn and Uranus is Chiron
Mm-hmm.
in orbit. So the bridge to get from Saturn to Uranus, to get from this reality, this plane, this world into a more enlightened way of being, or, kind of transcending reality, if you will, or maybe collective consciousness is through the healing of the
Mm-hmm.
collective, right? It's through identifying and maybe working on and through the wounds that we carry individually and together or collaboratively as well. So Uranus, kind of being this higher octave of Mercury, brings us to exactly what you were saying, which is radical thought, right? It's exalted mental states. It's pushing us to beyond the boundaries, right? And sometimes I look at Uranus as an archetype of like this combination of Jupiter and Saturn together.
I agree with that. Yes, I do.
Hmm. Where but then like it's still its own thing. And if you actually think about the relationship that the three of them have to each other in myth, Uranus was the god of the sky, right? Who basically killed and tried to consume his children because there was a prophecy that he was going to be overthrown. Kronos, Saturn,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
overthrew him.
Mm-hmm.
Same prophecy coming forward, overcoming. Jupiter, Zeus, did the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, the three of them do have a very interesting relationship with one another.
I agree.
So, okay, any other thoughts on Uranus? Do you want to speak a little bit to the archetype of Gemini as well?
Sure, I can do that. So Gemini as the archetype of the twins, right? So we're always thinking about duality wherever Gemini exists, right? You and I have talked about this plenty of times, but Gemini comes through for the yes and, right? Not
Mhm.
the either or. And is I think teaches us certainly that like multiple things can be and are true at once,
Mhm.
right? And is able to kind of hold all things, right? Kind of simultaneously. And excuse me, because of the kind of like dualistic nature of Gemini, I think we can also see like a very interesting juxtaposition that happens wherever Gemini is present as well, right? Which again is maybe where like the multiple truth thing kind of comes in. But Gemini is also the archetype of the student, right? So we see the desire to learn, right? The desire to acquire and digest information. I think we also see the desire to disseminate that information, right? And Gemini always ultimately looking to connect, right? Like that's always what I tell people too. Like at the end of the day, Gemini just wants to connect. So they're looking for that meeting of the minds, right? For that exchange of information. A lot of times with Gemini too, we think about like writing and reading and
Mhm.
communication and commerce and travel and trade. It's Mercury, right? So it points to a bunch of mercurial things. And so when we think about these two archetypes coming together with Uranus and Gemini, Uranus as that higher octave of Mercury, that's why I personally think that just collectively, Uranus and Gemini will be a much more enjoyable transit, and there will be more ease, I think, around that transit than Uranus and Taurus, which is the planet of radical change coming in and being like, "Hey, we want change, we want it now," and Taurus is like, "No, we don't." Right? Like we hate change. So like no thank you. And for me, this sort of entirety of Uranus and Taurus has felt really grueling, right? And I think there's a lot of people who share that sentiment. And I think there will just be a natural lightness, right, that kind of comes in with Uranus and Gemini. And because Gemini is also this very like quick, fast moving energy, and
Mhm.
Uranus is too, I think we're going to see a lot of rapid change and like a lot of turnover and things, yeah, with Uranus and Gemini.
I agree with that. And I think, especially in the early aughts of Uranus and Gemini, so not just this summer, but then kind of in 2026,
Mhm.
Uranus will trine, so harmonize with the previous Saturn Jupiter conjunction that we had in Aquarius that happened in 2020. And Pluto in Aquarius currently is passing over those degrees as well.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a rapid succession, right, kind of happening collectively that we're going to see. I often think too, or I believe that that's going to bring a lot of new inventions that we'll talk about, specifically in reading and writing and communication. It'll bring about the duality of things too, right? Being able to hold multiple perspectives or multiple truths. And it will also, I think, super impose the idea of polarity into our
Mhm.
lives more so. Um, it's we talked about this right before we started recording. The US's birth chart has a Uranus and Gemini in it natally. So
Mhm.
anytime Uranus comes into the sign of Gemini, US enters its Uranus return. And if we think about our electoral systems in the US, it's a very binary system in terms of the parties that exist. We don't like to exist outside that binary, outside of that polarity. Even if most people do not fall in either one of those systems, we feel like we have to choose either
Mhm.
one. So it could be potentially that one of the things that comes out of this period, right, may be the opening up to more ideologies, more parties, right? Or maybe wanting to expand out of that, right? We think about Uranus and trying to
Mhm.
like break free from the binary too. I think that, outside of, if we're going to continue to break out of the binary, we're going to see more degendering of things coming forward. But of course,
Mhm.
in true Gemini fashion, there will be the resistance to that as
Sure.
well, because we're going to
Mhm.
see both things happen at once. Um, and I feel as well that even in some of this duality, there's going to be the fight between ideologies in terms of like religious versus non-religious. And we're going to see people who are not necessarily religious crossing lines in some ways to support each other. A good example of this would be like some of the people that are surrounding the MAGA party right now are not necessarily religious people. Trump himself is not a religious person, right?
Mhm.
But he's crossed that line into evangelical world and like is acting like that Messiah. On the flip side, the Pope, right, who is this religious figure, has now flipped into more connecting to more progressive people, right? In promise of the word of, let's say, scripture, around like helping immigrants, helping the poor,
Mhm.
right? Open borders, things like that. So I think we are going to have to hold people differently. And
Yeah.
we're going to notice that there's going to be a lot of cross partying. Like, I think Maha is another good example. It used to be that the Earthy Crunchy was more progressive. Now the Earthy Crunchy has kind of moved into like anti-vax and like that
Mhm.
whole world too. So we're going to see a lot of this flip-flopping happen.
I definitely agree with that. And I think, yeah, you're right. We're already seeing a lot of those things. To think of the sort of like battling ideologies, that's obviously playing out very strongly as well, kind of already, and is bubbling to like a tipping point, I would say at this point. So yeah, that would not surprise me at all. I personally do hope that we start to kind of break out of that like binary political system here in the United States because we need it at this point because the binary system is a little wild. Not a little wild, it's horrible. It's horrible. But yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's a really good assessment because the other thing that you and I often speak about when we're thinking about Gemini is nuance, right? The idea of
Hmm.
nuance. And I think we have started to see more of that come forward with Jupiter and Gemini,
Hmm.
right? And we'll see how Uranus kind of like pushes that to extremes almost, right? Or at least starts to like push that idea of nuance forward a little bit because that's like the other way I think about Uranus a lot is like pushing that envelope, right? Or like advancing the conversation around something. So totally, totally.
Yeah, I love that you brought up nuance because I think that is something that Uranus and Gemini is going to continue to bring forward. And we think about Gemini too. At its worst, it's radical extremism, right?
Yeah.
Because it's being pulled to the very far ends. And we've seen that in history show up in Uranus and Gemini, right? So we've seen like fascist Germany versus like ultra socialist communist Russia, right? Or Soviet Union. We're seeing that now, right? We have like fascism kind of coming forward pretty strongly in the United States,
Yeah,
right?
but not
There,
kind of. Yeah.
yeah, like pretty strongly. But then there's also counter revolutions to that, right? There are
Mhm.
counter arguments to that. And I think because Uranus is the planet of revolution, it's the planet of change, and Gemini is a sign of the people, one of
Mhm.
them. Cancer actually being another sign of the people, ruled by the moon, moon being the planet of the populace. Um, we are in for, the people needing to vocalize, mobilize, right? Two very Gemini words to come together
Mhm.
to make the changes that they want to see. And the thing
Mhm.
that we're also going to find is that a lot of things are going to be grassroots.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
And
agree
this
with
is
that
because
100%.
Gemini is about locality. It's about
Yeah.
what's immediately in my sphere. What can I immediately change in my environment?
Mhm.
And that's, I think New York is a really great example of this. What's happening in New York City, where the mayoral candidate has like grassroots movement completely beat out long-term candidates, right? Did not use slanderous campaign, focused on the issues that the people wanted, and had some of the highest voter turnout for a primary
Mhm.
in New York in recent history.
Mhm. I agree.
So, so it'll be interesting to see, like that feels like a really big response to what is happening, on a grander scale in the political climate in the United States.
Yeah, I think like this summer in particular is also going to be a very interesting time because once Uranus actually moves into Gemini on the 7th, then that's when we have all of those planets harmonizing with one another, right? Like, yes, Pluto and Saturn and Neptune have already been harmonizing, but now we're bringing Uranus into the fold,
Hmm.
right? And that will be especially true throughout July and August. Saturn moving back into Pisces on September 1st, but like the next 2 months in particular, we'll really see that. And then, of course, kind of in like the beginning of next year, we have that harmonization again. But this is
Mhm.
our kind of first introduction to it. And actually, as you were talking about some of that stuff, it made me think of how that kind of influence of Saturn in Aries is coming in, where we talked about it in our video about like individuation, right?
Mhm.
And kind of like breaking free from something, and also Neptune wanting to like dissolve certain, with Saturn in particular, right? Like maybe we're dissolving some of those systems and structures to move towards that radical change of Pluto and Aquarius and Uranus and Gemini, and shifting more towards, like you said, like grassroots and completely like new and different ways that people are approaching like the socio-political battleground, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. Um, so, and of course, Uranus and Gemini being this great facilitator in all of this, right? Allowing it to be a space for us to exercise the nuance as we go through these radical changes, as we recognize these grassroots movements too. And of course, it can be both sides. So it's not just like progressive grassroots movements. It can also be, as we've noticed with MAGA, right? Like, although that's not really grassroots, but you know what I mean? Like,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, still same idea. It's like fringe ideology coming forward, and acting like a dominant ideology, but even though that's not necessarily true. So, as we mentioned in US history, Uranus and Gemini has brought about a lot of conflict. Obviously, it's because Uranus is in Gemini in the US birth chart, but we had the American Revolution, right? The Revolutionary War. We
Mhm.
had the Civil War, and then we had the United States entrance into World War II, not the beginning of World War II. I think it's really important that we say that because there's a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, it's World War II." It might be that's coming from a very American lens.
Yes.
The United States entered the war during Uranus and Gemini,
Mm-hmm.
but the
Yeah,
war
it's
was
very
already going
important.
on.
Yeah, like World War II, the official start date of that is like September 1st, 1939. So it was really while Uranus was in Taurus, which is
Mhm.
like where now we see all kinds of interesting things going on around the world. But when you brought that up when we were talking about that earlier, I was like, yeah, that's a super important distinction. That's when the United States entered. It's not when the war actually started.
Mhm. But it's also when the war ended.
Yes, which is important for people to remember too. Yes, that is when the war ended. Uranus was still in Gemini. We had the Nuremberg trials that started during that time as well. So yes, I think that's very important to highlight and remember.
Yes. And, we talk about, oh, well, there was this civil war, but that was because of discourse around ideology, right? Again, partly. There's so many reasons that the Civil War happened. We say that it was the discourse around slavery, but we also know people in the North owned slaves. So it really had, that was just the red herring. But there's so many things that were happening around like trying to pull apart. But if you think about it, we had the American Revolution, which was pulling us away from British rule. Then we
Mm-hmm.
had the Civil War, which was us against each other. And then we entered World War II, which was a unification of us against, other entities. So, but also at the end, Civil War also ended with Uranus and Gemini, right? Revolutionary War also ended with Uranus and Gemini, all bringing unification of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
There will always be friction in the extremism in the binary, but that's the job of Uranus and Gemini is to radically change our ideologies around the binary and bring us closer together. Because Gemini is about the space between the thing, not the
Yeah.
two opposing factors.
Mm-hmm. I
That's where the
agree.
nuance comes in. So when we hear people say, oh, Uranus and Gemini is going to bring war and conflict, it's actually going to has the potential to actually bring unification, things more close together, in my opinion.
No, I love that, and I agree with that. That's I think you and I share the perspective of some of the sort of like radical fear mongering
Yeah.
type of discourse that happens around things like this. And while I think it's important to obviously talk about the real life events that have happened historically during these transits, we have free will as a people. We don't have to choose war, right? We don't have to do X, Y, and Z. Um, and as I always tell people, we can see the same themes emerge, but not necessarily the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, if there's conflict, then it's the purpose of that conflict is to bring
Yeah,
potentially more
yeah,
unification.
yes, one way or the other,
Because
right?
because in true Gemini fashion, it's equal and opposite reactions. Every
Mm-hmm,
action has an equal and opposite reaction. Uranus and Gemini has taught us that.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, I think the interesting piece here is that in the last Uranus and Gemini, we were on the, I'm going to say right side of history in some way, right? And in this case, we're not necessarily as a country. So then it's bringing us back to, that into that direction as opposed to pulling us backward.
I agree.
So I think that's where I want to leave it with the war
Mhm.
situation in terms of Uranus and Gemini, other than that there was a peasants' revolt previously as well in Uranus and Gemini. But again, it's the power to the people. And I think
Mhm.
that that deals a lot with classism,
I
right?
agree, 100%.
Um, and I think Uranus is about leveling the playing field across the board in general. So I think, we're seeing, as we know, a lot of classism. And what's interesting is that Uranus and Gemini has also, in terms of leveling the playing field, has actually brought in history more access to
Mhm.
education, access to writing, access to information, which does level the playing field, right? Because
Absolutely.
education is power.
Mhm.
And that's why they try to keep you from it,
Mm-hmm.
the powers
Yeah,
that
well,
be.
that is exactly where I was going to go with my next thought too, right? Is we're leveling the playing field through accessibility to
Mhm.
things, right? Knowledge, of course, being a major one. Again, we think of the student, right? We think of writing and reading and all of those things with Gemini. So, we had discussed that there was like the access to the first public library, right? That opened
Mhm.
during Uranus and Gemini, the printing press. Um, what were some of the other ones? Something about the
So
newspaper?
Yep. So it was the printing revolution. The King James Bible was invented or was written during this time. The first newspapers were written and then started to be distributed. The creation of the Pony Express, which eventually became,
Our mail
it didn't last very
system.
long, Pony Express, but at some point it became like a mail system,
Mhm,
right? Which also feels very Gemini in general.
mhm, mhm,
There were computing, like technological advances during, post World War II and during World War II. There was the scientific revolution with Isaac Newton, right, on law of mechanics and gravitation. There was the wave theory of light, right?
mhm.
Like us being able to understand that light moves through wavelengths and that we see certain ones and don't see certain ones. I was actually looking as well. The book 1984 was written in Uranus and Gemini.
Bye. Okay, everyone could stand to read that one again. I'm
Yes,
just saying.
yes, I agree.
That's everyone's homework for this Uranus and Gemini is read 1984. Thank you.
Um, During one period of Uranus and Gemini, I think it was in the, was it the 40s, or there was one period in Uranus and Gemini where Britain had the Education Act that said that
Yeah.
every person has the right to education, free meals, and milk, you know?
Yes.
Um, so like there's that. There was underground railways being opened in London during this time in the 1860s. I think it's 1863. Sound recording. There were so many technological advancements, so many
Mhm.
communication advancements. So one of the things that we're going to see, obviously, through Uranus and Gemini is like basically innovation around how we access information, who we're talking to, how we're communicating, where we're going. Transportation is a big one.
No, I completely agree with that. We also noted that there was the first color photograph during
Hmm.
Uranus and Gemini. And so, and I think I get why people are like, oh my God, war, like whatever. But I feel like we cannot ignore the sort of like maybe more traditional archetypal, manifestations of like what does again, the blending of like Uranus and Gemini mean? And in my mind, it has always been around like mass communication, or the ways that we receive and disseminate information, education in general, right? Like students, higher education, all of that. So I think all of those things make sense, right? Like the Pony Express, I feel is such a perfect example because we started to see like more mass like communication happening through a
Connection.
new means of transport also,
Yeah.
right? So, and that feels very like Mercury's coming through and doing its
Well,
thing
and I
too,
think
right?
I think newspapers as well. Like here's what's going on locality, right?
Yeah,
Gemini.
yeah.
And let's distribute that to the people. But then also how newspapers have become global as a
Mm-hmm.
result, like over time, right? We're all reading each other's newspapers and
Mm-hmm.
newsstands and
And blogs and yeah. Also, one thing I think we're going to see the rise of during Uranus and Gemini is more independent journalism.
Mhm.
I think Jupiter and Gemini laid the groundwork for that, where it was that kind of like boom around like more written type of communication. Everyone started a Substack or
Substack.
a blog or things like that. And we're starting to see now. I see them all the time, and I follow a few of them. More of these independent journalists that are popping up on Substack and on Threads, and I'm sure there's a bunch of them on TikTok. But I wish I could remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but he was this really long time news anchor for like a really big, was it CNN? Was it, I don't know, right? But he got booted or he
Mm.
left, I think is really what it was, because something that he viewed as unethical was happening there. And so he left and then he immediately turned around and started a Substack like
Yeah.
that day and was like, I'm still going to report the news, you know what I mean? But I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And I think
Yeah.
he's also started to turn it into like a podcast and this whole thing. And so all of the even podcasts perhaps will continue to see, kind of like perhaps an evolution somehow around
Hmm.
podcasts. Yes, I think that kind of independent journalism, because that also feels very grassroots too, right? And being like, hey, I'm not connected to like ABC, CNN, and NPR, any of those places. It's just me.
Right. Exactly. And I also think that the accessibility of information through different forms of language, even more
Mm.
so. So, like, we're already seeing translation becoming a lot easier via devices.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
there will be more of that, I think, too, where there's less miscommunications just because there are language barriers. I think
Hmm.
that's something that we will see dissolve or that we will be able to transcend beyond is language barrier.
Fully agree with that. I love that.
Some of the greatest, some of the writings that we still reference in modern day have come up during Uranus and Gemini. And mentioned the King James Bible. Regardless of how
Mhm.
you feel about the Bible, that is still a very referenced piece of literature.
I think that's the most popular version of the Bible that's out there, I
It
think.
is. It is. There was Dickens was producing novels during this time. Dumas, Tolstoy, right? As I mentioned, 1984 was written,
Mhm.
but previously in Uranus and Gemini, Anne Frank's diary was written in Uranus and Gemini. Um, there was, I'm trying to think of Joseph Campbell's A Thousand Faces,
Mhm.
George Orwell's Animal Farm was also
Okay.
written in Uranus and Gemini. Um, trying to think what else was written during this time. There's so many, so
Yeah.
many things
Yeah.
that were written. So, I think books and printing are also going to have a lot of inventiveness. We already have digital printing, right? We also have drop printing and we already have independent publishing. but I think there's going to be more. I think the publishing industry is one that will probably be radicalized or shifted in the next 7 years in some way. Not saying it's going away. It's just it's going to have to stand to change out of ways that it's existed before.
I completely agree with that. And you and I kind of touched on this a little bit before we started recording, but historically, we've also seen a lot of kind of like inventiveness and whatever around like the paper with
Mhm.
Pluto and Aquarius. And so having them both there, right, and coexisting over the next 7 years, I totally agree with that. There's going to be something really interesting that kind of comes out of that. What that is, I don't know. But I absolutely think, yeah, any publishing entity, and that kind of industry as a whole, I absolutely think is going to experience a lot of change. I think education as a whole, right? Like we'll see a lot of change there as well. You had mentioned maybe like trade more than.
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting. So Gemini rules trade and commerce because of Mercury, its rulership there. I believe, Gemini also can be seen as like broad strokes of knowledge or super niche. Like they're really interested in like a few different things. And I think what's going to happen in education is that, and we already see this, is that traditional college or higher ed is shifting. It's gone a lot more online. There's been a lot more like deeper focus in education, but I think that we're going to start to step away from going traditional college route and focusing more on specific niches, whether they're trades or maybe you want to be a nurse and so you just only focus on what you need to know to do that job,
Yeah.
essentially. We're also going to see people who are just going to pick up little classes here and there, right? And then infuse their experience as a form of their knowledge and their wisdom that they will apply into. So there might be more co-ops that come up
Mhm.
too, like on the job trainings, on the job experiences, not necessarily needing all of the education either to depending on the work to, enter certain workforces as well. We also saw the GI Bill came about in Uranus and Gemini, and that changed the workforce a lot too,
Mhm. Mhm.
around like rights. So in that case, it was veterans' rights, but there
Yeah.
can be other workers' rights that can come up during Uranus and Gemini. It also, I think we've talked about this. Maybe it was in the Neptune in Aries video, but like unionization being something
Mhm.
that came up a lot, like a lot of things around like unions and workers' rights coming up too. So having both of those feels like a
I feel
call
like
to.
also with the nodes where they are right now too,
Mhm.
right?
Oh,
South
that's
Node
what
and
it
Virgo.
was.
Yeah,
That's what it
because you
was.
had talked about the South Node and Virgo. Um, we're changing our relationship to labor, right? And we
Hmm.
are seeing a change in like laborers, or excuse me, workers' rights and all of that. So yeah. So for
There
like
will
the
be a
next year.
Well, and there will be a period right before the nodes change into Leo and Aquarius that Uranus is at the bending of the nodes.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh, I didn't even think about that. Okay, that would be interesting too. Mm. Next, like late spring, early
Yes.
summer next year, friends.
Um, okay. So, in terms of like I think other modes of transportation will come forward, or that we will continue to refine how we transport. I think EV will be a really interesting one, electric vehicles.
Yeah.
Um, Not even speaking of Tesla, although, whatever, that can go die. But
Yeah.
more just thinking of the technology around that. Will there be more accessibility? Will more people access that industry, other forms of renewable resources or like renewable energy? Because the internal combustible engine was invented during Uranus and Gemini, and I think that is what's going to get changed.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
The rechargeable battery was also first invented in Uranus and Gemini too.
Perfect. Okay. And
Mhm.
I mean, we use those all the time. Our phones have them, our laptops have them, I mean, everything. Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting, actually, because, one of the sort of like major issues that gets talked about a lot in relation to like climate change and all of that is all of our like electronic waste
Mhm.
of like around like old phones, old laptops, things like that. So yeah, actually, I love that insight.
Yeah, microwave ovens were also invented during Uranus and Gemini.
Shout out to the microwave
Mobile
oven.
mobile telephone services.
Uh, Right. That feels so
So
Uranus and Gemini to me. I can't stand it.
I
Right. Like
know.
revolutionizing the technology through which we communicate. I mean, that's just going to keep happening. It really is.
Well, and then like LPs and 45 vinyls were also invented during Uranus and Gemini, which is funny because I feel like vinyls are having like they have been for a while, but totally having like this resurgence as well. I think and I think I mentioned the first general purpose use of a digital computer, right, also kind of came out as a result of Uranus and Gemini. So it's going to be major technological advancements. The space age also sort of started in Uranus and Gemini too, towards the end of its transit, which was like the V2 rocket.
Roswell.
I know. Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. The V2 rocket, Project Diana radar off the moon, and then we did put a monkey in space, which, ooh. But then there was also the Roswell incident in 1947, and I think that mixed with like a little Pluto and Aquarius. I mean,
Mhm.
are
Aliens.
there aliens?
Oh,
Extraterrestrial, you guys. So, and it could even be like our relationship to traveling into space as
I could
well.
totally see that. Oh my God, yeah, I could totally see like, yes, a space age, space travel, a resurgence around those things. Especially, when you think about like the last time that Uranus was in Gemini, I mean, so much of that was too around like, oh my God,
Especially as a
yes.
result, like coming off of that,
Fun.
the
Yeah, I guess
50s.
that's what I mean. Yeah, like right
Yeah,
after that into the 50s. And that's what it was all about. It was very like Jetsons realness, in the 50s. And, that's so interesting actually, because I have thought about that before and been like, the 50s were like so obsessed with this, like the space race and all of
mhm.
that. And we've never, like, even though we are like decades into the future now, we've like never really come back to that. So
The
I wonder.
80s, there were points in the 80s that were like that. But what's interesting is that when that period in the 80s was like that,
Mhm.
that was Uranus and Sag. So it was
Oh
the
my God, the
Uranus
opposition.
opposition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay, interesting.
and I'll be curious. So people who have Uranus and Sagittarius, this is going to be your Uranus opposition, which I jokingly call the
Mhm.
midlife crisis in
Oh, I
astrology.
call it that too. Oh my God, I totally
Yeah,
call it that too.
that's so funny. But I wonder if like people who have Uranus and Sag are going to be taking some of the leads in like this
Mhm.
space race situation, space age situation. I also wonder too, like in true Gemini form, there's going to be a disparity where there's going to be like when we're already seeing it, right? Where like Katy Perry and Gail King got launched into space, right? Like, a big eye roll, big eye roll. And like there's going to be this extreme of like, well, that's for the ultra wealthy,
Yeah,
right? So they can leave anytime that they want. Like maybe Uranus and Cancer is them trying to colonize the moon, or I don't know, or Mars or something.
Elon's wet dream. Yeah.
Ew, and
Um,
he's a Cancer. Bye.
and he is a Cancer. Yeah. Bye.
Uh,
Just somebody just needs to, you know.
anyways, uh, but then I also feel that like where we're seeing like the plebes, the regular people, us being like, wait a minute, like we have to fix this
Yeah.
planet, right? And then kind of that sort of fight or infighting kind of happening, that polarity existing where like we're seeing advancements, but then also we're like, wait a minute, what
But
about
what
this
about
burning planet that we're sitting on?
hmm I do have to say, and in that same vein, I do think it will be interesting to see what's going to happen around AI with Uranus and Gemini because so much of the conversation we're already having is like AI is literally sucking the planet dry. Like it
Yeah.
is using up all of our like water resources and like in the cities where they have these power plants or whatever,
Mhm.
to power AI, it is literally like draining these cities of their water resources. And so, that's not sustainable. obviously. We all literally need water to live. And so I absolutely think that there will be some kind of change, radical change around like how are we going to power AI and have it be like a sustainable thing? Because my own views on AI aside,
Hmm.
the toothpaste is not going back in the tube. You know what I
No.
mean?
And that opens the door to some other things that Uranus and Gemini could bring that's maybe not so great, which is like big data,
Yeah.
digital IDs,
Yes.
surveillance, right? Um,
Facial recognition. Yeah.
Like where in the US, it's the what's the license with the star, the real ID, right?
ID.
Yeah. Also like the overrun of like deep fakes, right? Because of AI, the inability to
Totally.
distinguish, which it can be very
Mhm.
Gemini, like to distinguish what's real and what isn't real.
Mhm.
Quantum computing as well,
Yep.
maybe coming forward, augmented
Absolutely.
realities. It'd be interesting to see what happens with video games too. Because we're talking a lot about like computing, we're talking a lot about like printing, we're talking a lot about books and publishing, but like video games is another form of like augmented reality,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so it'd be really fascinating to see, maybe especially when Uranus is at the bending of the nodes, because I think about like Pisces and like the escape of reality. And then
Yeah.
like the super detailed orientation you have to have like Virgo
Yeah,
to
with the
be like a
dexterity and whatnot.
mhm. And dexterity, right? Hands.
Yeah.
Um, very, very Gemini. It'd be interesting to see what happens with video games during that period. I like Nintendo just put out the Switch 2, right? Which is supposed to like it's not drastically different, but there I think there might be more computing or gaming things that come
I could
forward that
totally see that.
that
Oh my
will
God.
totally be different. Um, hmm, Self-driving cars, obviously drones, things like that, like are also going to come forward. Would be interesting. Maybe like self-driving trains would be something that
Mm,
might come forward too. Lithium batteries, electric cars, charging points, all of these things feel very Uranus
I
and
agree.
Gemini to me. And then maybe even I talked about revolutionizing labor. I wonder how the computation of technology, like whatever we're doing with technology, how that changes not just our relationship to labor, but labor
Period.
overall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree
Like,
because that's also part of that like AI conversation too, right? Where it's like, oh, we're going to be able to give these jobs basically, right? Designate these tasks to AI, which will sort of null, needing to have real people here. And I think that's where we'll see that disparity too, actually, with Uranus and Gemini,
mhm,
because it makes me think of Duolingo. Right, like they came out and they were like, "Hey, we're getting rid of all of our like real life people that do the translating and like whatever with the programming and the languages, and we're replacing it with AI." And they
mhm,
received such horrible pushback on that. And people were like, I'm leaving you now because you're forcing AI upon me. And it ended up being so bad that
mhm.
Duolingo like rolled it back. And they were like,
Yeah.
JK guys, we need to hire a bunch of people to like come back and do this job now because we're not going to do AI. So I think
Language.
yeah. We didn't mention this, but we did look up and see that the first French dictionary was published during Uranus and Gemini. So again, that like widely
Language.
available, widely accessible
Mhm.
language, right? So say Duolingo. We'll see what happens with like do I don't even know what the other programs are, but all of those programs around like
Yeah.
the gamification of language. Mhm.
It'll be interesting too, like the I wonder if Uranus and Gemini will also help with like decentralizing cell phone networks. Like, we have like all the big mobile networks. I wonder either they're going to try to become a big conglomerate or they're going to have to be like completely separated, like through monopolies, like whatever the Monopoly Act. I can't think of what it is right now in my head. But like kind of segmenting that out and like kind of having like free access to like certain technological things, mobile services, free energy becoming a thing too in response to.
Mhm.
Um, some of what we're seeing. And then maybe like, in true Gemini fashion, maybe there being like extreme weather or like grid issues that create
Mhm.
us needing to be more renewable or forcing us into that space.
That's so interesting. This makes me also think of um, things like Linux and like free and open software and things like that, because that is such a thing in like the computer world and the hacking world in particular, where people aren't running like Mac iOS or Windows, they're running like Linux,
Yeah.
Kali. There's all kinds out there, right? And like the whole point of free and open software is, it's not this proprietary software from either Apple or
Hmm.
Google or Microsoft. And it's literally to make it like more available to the people and
Hmm.
give them more options outside of these huge conglomerates. So I would not be surprised if that sees like a boost during Uranus and Gemini as well.
Totally. I think so too. Um, I definitely believe that like accessibility is sort of like the key to Uranus and Gemini, right?
I agree.
Information overload also, like we're already
Yeah,
seeing where we're overwhelmed by all of the news. It's going to be more
100%.
shocking news, it's going to be more disruptive news. But like online learning, radical reform to education, freedom of speech becoming like the red herring in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways too, which we're already seeing.
I was gonna say we're already seeing that so much. Yeah,
Um, but yeah, like it'll be fascinating to see how we respond because I think in the same way as we're seeing technological advancements in true Gemini duality form, we're also going to see people resist or pull back and want more
absolutely.
tactility, more connection, more in person, more face to face, more small community. Like as we're
Hmm.
extending and reaching further into the world, the globe, into space, potentially aliens, we are also going to want to like stay closer to each other,
I
right?
completely agree with that. I think we're starting to see that already. Like there are people who feel so disenfranchised with like
Hmm.
Meta, for example, and people that just are like, I'm closing down my Instagram, I'm
Hmm.
getting off of Threads, and people are like, I just want to be like more in my real life.
Hmm.
I feel that desire all the time. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would not be surprised at all.
I think a misstep that the publishing industry could do would be to slowly stop producing paper books
I 100% agree with that.
because I think like physical books are going to continue to have a resurgence,
Hmm.
even more so than they already have, especially as people are trying to uncouple themselves from Amazon because Kindle is owned by Amazon.
Hmm.
And that's the only one I can think. There's plenty of other ones that have books that you can buy digitally online and whatever, and they are accessible, and that's the good thing, right? But I think people are going to want more. Like, I've read certain things about Barnes and Nobles were closing in different areas, and people like went there in droves and like started buying books and like trying to keep them alive.
Hmm.
So, and like Barnes and Noble has had a boom as a result and has like opened
Hmm.
a bunch of stores.
Hmm.
And of course, like the romanticy and like all these people who are really interested in these and trying to
Yeah.
escape reality, Pisces, North Node, in terms of book, Uranus and Gemini, I think like that's going to continue to grow. I think whatever we saw Jupiter and Gemini bring up, like that's what we're going to see radical change to in Uranus and Gemini in the
A
7 year
hundred
period.
percent. No, I completely agree with you. And that's actually something that I was going to say at the beginning of the video is like, okay, we just did this year of Jupiter and Gemini. Now we're
Hmm.
going to see Uranus come in and take it that much farther.
Hmm.
Right. So, and I completely agree with you. I am such a purist with books that way. I've never been like an e-reader girly. I understand their purpose. I understand why it's appealing to people. And I think there is a certain accessibility element that actually makes them really important. But for me, I want to hold the physical book in my hand. And I will always be that way. And like I remember going through college and working for my first paper. And they
Hmm.
were just like, well, like, we still do our physical print copies, but that's going to go away. And everybody's going to stop physically printing. And it's all just going to be digital. And I was like, ew,
Yeah.
like, no. Um, so,
I think curiosity is something that's going to be like a guiding light too, but
oh,
also the
yeah.
fears that we have in curiosity too. I think it's worth mentioning that the Salem witch trials happened during Uranus and Gemini.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I haven't seen anybody bring that up.
hmm
And obviously, I see people talk about the Salem witch trials all the time.
I know.
Um, and then you had made a great comment when we were discovering that the what is it, the single cat lady or whatever, that just
It
like,
it's the demonization of the things that we're afraid of, and I think that like Uranus and Gemini calls it to attention the tests of our faith and puts us in front of our fears in a lot of ways, right? Like space age, there's a lot of fear to that, right? Technology growing, there's a lot of fear to that. Moving beyond the belief systems that we have, there's a lot of fear in that, and it's being able to exist in them and be open to ideas without being consumed by the fear of those things. So, we might see some. I don't mean like witch hunting literal witches, but there might be versions of like witch hunts. We're already seeing it with immigration, right?
Hmm.
So Uranus and Gemini might bring up kind of this duality of like we're witch hunting, but then also the revolt against that as well. Like, how do we stand our ground and allow ourselves to reclaim the thing that people are afraid of, right? Or like,
Yeah.
how do we support the thing that people are afraid of? In this case, immigration is what I'm talking about, but in any
Hmm.
way, right? Like belief systems. Um, and the Salem witch trials wasn't necessarily about witches, obviously. It was land grabs,
Yeah.
right? It was about resources. There was always an undercurrent. And really, with Uranus and Gemini, it's being able to expose the thing that's actually the problem, not the thing that we're saying is the problem. So in that case, it's this woman's a witch, but really we want access to her resources, right? So if we get rid of her, that becomes ours. So same thing as like, we're seeing in the US, there's so many pieces of information being thrown at us, and they're all like ruses for the main thing that's actually happening below the surface. The
Hmm.
other thing happening parallel, very Gemini as well.
Hmm. Hmm. I completely agree.
Um,
Mm.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that you feel. I think wake up call is a word or like a phrase, not a word, but a phrase I want to give Uranus and Gemini. It is a wake up call. Like, I hate to say this, but like for the US, Pearl Harbor was their wake up call
Right.
to, to help end World War II, right? We don't need
Yes.
anything that major to be a wake up call, right? So I want to be clear there. But there has been often throughout Uranus and Gemini things that like jolted us awake
Hmm.
and made
Hmm.
us go, oh, yeah,
Hmm.
this isn't the vibe. Like we don't want this at all. I
Yeah.
think the book 1984, right, written during Uranus and Gemini, was also a wake up call to a lot of
Yeah.
people, or potentially should have been a wake up call to a lot of people. We're living in it.
I know.
But,
But no, I
but,
agree with you. Yeah, I'm very curious to see what that thing is going to be, I guess. And I feel like, I personally, I'm sure you do too, see more and more outcries from people around like how far are we going to take it, or how far are we going to let it go before we're like actually standing up and doing something.
mhm,
And I see more and more people too being like, great, we're protesting and whatever, but
mhm,
like, what are our list of demands, right? Like, what's the next step after
mhm.
showing up in the streets? Which is actually a real conversation, that needs to be had. Because yeah, we need that kind of like, we need to start taking it further. So I
Well,
don't know.
what
We
makes me
will
think about
see.
it makes me think about accountability,
Mm,
right? Uranus and Gemini bringing up in history accountability, right? Who was accountable for, in this case, like let's say World War II, the Nuremberg trials happened during Uranus and Gemini,
right.
right? The Declaration of Human Rights globally, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written during that time too. So there's a lot of people or situations that we can hold accountable. We can
Yeah.
bring end to conflict and bring greater unification. We can explore consciousness. I think not the first, but a scientific study around taking doses of LSD to expand consciousness happened in Uranus and Gemini too. So
Hmm.
like maybe we'll see, especially under um, North Node in Pisces, maybe like the expansion or shift of like using recreational drugs as a form of like healing or medicine.
Hmm.
But yeah, it'll be fascinating to see what sort of comes up during this period and how we choose as people, and Gemini being the sign of choice and decision making, how we choose to revolutionize our future. It's not
Mhm.
a guarantee that we're entering war. It's not a guarantee that aliens are going to come. It's not a guarantee that we're going to have advancements in technology. It's our decisions that we make that happen,
Mhm.
or
100%.
not, or not. So. Any final words on Uranus and Gemini at all?
I don't think so. I feel like we covered it all. I will say just this came up for me when you were talking about like a wake up call, right? Like Richard Tarnas wrote a book on Uranus and it's literally called The Great Awakener. So
Hmm.
I think, yeah, that's like such an astute point.
Richard Tarnas is an incredible astrologer, focusing a lot on Uranus-Pluto cycles in particular, I believe. Cosmos
Mm-hmm.
and Psyche is also a really great
The
book.
best. No, literally the
Yeah,
best one.
there's a docu series kind of um, called, hold on, it'll come to me, Changing of the Gods. That
Mm.
was really, really good. Based off of Richard Tarnas's work, his daughter, I believe, had a hand in making that too,
Mm.
or being a part of that project. So if you're ever curious about like historical changes in terms of like generational influence in planets, then you should take a look at Richard Tarnas's work. The last
Oh
thing I
yeah.
want to bring up in terms of technology is wearables from a fashion
Mm.
perspective, right? So there's going to be a lot of shifting and changing around wearables. Something that's come up I've seen a lot lately is the Aura Ring, hands being
Yeah.
connected to Gemini, people wearing that. There will be other communication devices might be baked into the clothing, new tech and creating fabrics too.
Mm.
It'd be interesting to see if we could lab create sustainable resources. Like, how do you lab create cotton? How do you lab create hemp? How do you lab create silk, right? Without like harming maybe the animal or the earth or whatever the thing is. That, because I think cloning is something that might come up with Uranus and Gemini in a weird way too.
Mhm.
Whether that's like the clones via AI, like the voice,
Yeah.
like cloning people's voices. Scarlett Johansson just had like a whole issue around
Mhm.
that.
Which is
Um,
weird. She literally did that movie, Her.
I know, I know,
Life imitates art. It's fine.
but like sometimes too much. And the other piece to that, to the wearables, there's been some. My husband told me this. Um, there's been some conversation around RFK trying to get all Americans to wear wearables to be able to track data and information too. And of course, they say that while wearing an Apple Watch. But the moment that if that becomes implemented, this is going in the ocean. Um, like never, nope, not for me. Anyways, but the point being that wearables are going to become really prevalent over the next 7 years too,
Right.
even more so.
Mhm.
It's going to be in the shoes, it's going to be in the gloves, it's going to be like in fashion, in vogue to do so. I also think from a trend perspective, Uranus and Gemini is going to mix a lot of trends so much that we're going to lose a focus on trends.
I could totally see that. Oh my God, I could totally see that. Because you always hear people talking about like micro trends and
Yes,
things.
that's the
Yeah, I
thing
think we're
that's
gonna have
going
1 million micro trends. Yeah.
too many micro, and it's going to be like overwhelming. And I mean, the positive of that is like the resurgence of personal style and not
Mhm.
necessarily trend dictated style. I also feel that Uranus and Gemini will bring about like a more whimsical kind of way of
Oh, I
dressing, I
hope
think.
so. I totally hope so.
And as I
I
mentioned, sorry, it's going to also increase the degendering of fashion. But that could go two ways. That could be like degendering to the point where like we're all pretty bare into like, wearing gray clothes, which I don't think will happen, or just kind of continuing to move towards a space of being more inclusive. Go ahead, sorry.
Mm. No, I totally agree. I hope it's more inclusive, not
Not
like
like dystopian.
yeah, yeah, not dystopian gray, not dystopian gray. Um, okay. I mean, I can totally see how all of those things, will manifest during Uranus and Gemini. Um, Yeah, be very interesting. I do hope it's more whimsical. I think that
Me
would be
too.
more fun.
Me too. I think we could use that.
Yeah, no,
Um,
definitely.
like, oh, I think we could be more inventive too with fashion,
I
which is where I
agree.
think the micro trends are going to come in. Um, because it's going to feel so personal, and then it's going to be like everyone's point of view, everyone's perspective all the time. And so there's going to be a
Yeah,
lot of inundation around trends.
yeah, I do think that kind of like information overwhelm that you mentioned earlier, I absolutely see that.
Hmm.
For, Uranus and Gemini, hopefully not the entire time. But I could totally, yeah, I could see that in any and every area while Uranus
Hmm.
is in Gemini.
Same. Um, okay, my friend, this has been so enlightening. Any last words, thoughts, ideas before we? So, if you liked this, please like and subscribe. But also, j- and even if you don't, I actually don't care. I'm more concerned about you all checking out some of our other videos or just really following us on other social channels, which will be in the description below. Uranus enters Gemini on July 7th. On July 8th, Aubrey has her third published work coming out by Llewellyn. It's the no, Stellar Sex.
Color sex, yep.
It-
All about sextrology. So the
yes.
combination of literal sex and astrology.
Already the reviews are coming in, speaking of inclusivity, talking about how inclusive and how open your writing has been. It's not heteronormative, it's kink positive, it's, willing to expand and extend beyond, right, what society deems as acceptable and making the conversation feel around sex feel more tangible, more intimate, and more connected. All very Uranus and Gemini.
Also more nuanced because it comes out when Uranus is in Gemini. Yeah, yeah. No, I really did very intentionally approach the writing of this book wanting it to be inclusive. There is literally a book out there titled Sextrology. It's a little bit older of a
Mhm.
book. It's still a great book, but it is very dated. That one focuses exclusively on the sun sign astrology, whereas my approach is the entire birth chart. And they literally have the book divided into like Libra man, Libra woman,
Mhm.
Pisces man, Pisces woman, right? And it's very, very gender binary. And so I wanted something more contemporary, right? More inclusive. I personally do not believe in dividing the signs into men and women and or anything like that. I don't think it matters. And I think that is a really dated, really reductive view of things. So anyways, my point is yes, the reviews are all talking about how inclusive it is, which makes me very happy that I was actually able to like have that intention shine through and translate, because I think it's super important for people of all and any and every gender expression, sexual orientation, relationship style, etc., to have something that they can turn to that isn't going to feel like it's alienating them.
Mhm. I love it. So you can pick up this book at bookstores very soon, post July 8th. Prior to that, you can pre-order it, um, I believe, on the Llewellyn website and wherever you can pre-order books. Highly
Earlier, yeah.
recommend it. Yeah. Or you can just wait until after July 8th and pick it up at any place that major retailer that sells books. And if you want it at your local independent bookstore, please reach out to them.
Even better, yes.
So
Okay. I love you, Anthony. Thank you for plugging my book.
that's it.
You're,
All right, my friends. If you
okay.
need anything else from us, you can get us below. But bye for now.